right, let's dive a little bit deeper into structure. I just wanted to put up this first slide for you. We refer to generations in a variety of different ways. So it's kind of important to think about structure as it relates to the different generations. And I'm sure this doesn't happen in this area in Pennsylvania as it did in Midwest and, the Mid-South that I was working in, that there were worship wars. I'm sure it doesn't happen here. But think about worship and the different desires of what worship looks like depending on generations. And you think, well, we haven't ever gone through worship wars like we are today. Well, that's true and not true. So there have been worship wars, different styles and who wants what for generations. But I think it's particularly more difficult in today's world because we have sometimes 3, 4, and 5 generations in one church. So think about even generationally, if you're trying to work through worship with several generations, how that might affect things, right? So regardless of how it affects our worship, it affects our structure as well. So the way we do church is changing. You all have felt this, that when my Grandma Edwards, who lived until she was 97 and was still driving and playing bridge 4 times a week and living on her own, amen, I hope I have those genes. When Grandma said regular worship attendance, what did that mean? Every Sunday, right? What is average worship attendance in today's world? Yeah, I'm a regular attender. I attend 1.7 times a month. That's the national average, 1.7 times a month. That is a regular attender. Now, we could sit here and talk about that all day and be upset about that. Yes. However, that's our current culture. That's what we're dealing with, right? So the very people that used to be there every week and were maybe more bought in, or they heard communication every week, instead of you have to communicate the same thing 3 or 4 times for everyone to hear it, 3 or 4 different Sundays, because not everybody is there, right? So attendance has changed. So not only has attendance changed at worship experiences, but attendance has changed for meetings. How many of you have email meetings? How many of you have Facebook meetings, Facebook Live, or Skype, or telephone, webinar? You see, friends, if we want the young people who have grown up in the digital age, that's how they interact with the world, to be involved in leadership in the church, we've got to think about how we meet in different ways as well. Not only is it more effective, but it's more efficient as well. There's no drive time to get to the meeting. Now, you see, we used to do meetings, and how many times do we do a meeting, and it's supposed to start at, say, 7, and we really get started at what? 7:15, 7:30? Why? Because that was just as much about social time as it was about the meeting. You see, because we didn't have all of that social media and ways to connect in ways that were beyond face-to-face or telephone. And if you grew up in a small town like me, it was party lines, right? Talk about aging myself. Somebody, if there's a millennial sitting at your table, would you turn to them and explain what that is? But your Generation Xers and millennials, friends, they do their social time in a different way. So to come and spend 15 or 30 minutes catching up, they're frustrated. They're juggling all these balls in the air and probably work and family. Some are still going to college. And then we're going to sit here and we're going to have a conversation when I've done that all day, social media. I don't need to know what's going on because I've been on Facebook. So do you see the frustration even within our generations and how we lead? And the other thing is, most of our young people don't want to come to a meeting to find out what's already happened. Meetings are about aligning us to go forward. Let's roll up our sleeves and make a difference in the future. We're not here just to report on the past. Now, reporting on the past and evaluating are two different things, are they not? Because you see, sometimes we say, oh, well, we had 75 children show up for trunk or treat. Okay. So that? Why? What are we going to do? Not that we shouldn't celebrate the 75 children. But did we get their name? Did we intentionally try to build relationships when we were with them? Or did we have the servant attitude on to say, we're going to make sure they have a really good time and we're going to be really busy giving out candy? But we missed the opportunity to build a relationship because the why was never identified. So how do we even evaluate its effectiveness when we didn't even really determine the why other than we're going to have an event? Do you see what I'm saying? This is where the adaptive piece comes into play. So when we are planning, not only are we going to plan for the event itself, but we're going to talk about how did this align with our purpose of making disciples and live into God's preferred future, our vision. And then after it's over, we're going to evaluate it against that. You see, that's what your young people want to be about. So we're frustrated that we don't have leaders, but we haven't adapted generationally how we come together and the work that we're doing together. The other thing that is shifting is committees to teams. Now, I know they're closely related terms, but their functions are very different, okay? So it goes something like this. Committees are those things that somebody might call and say, well, nominations met. Y'all are doing that this time of year, or maybe you're just done. And that's when people do not answer their phone. You know that, right? Because the problem is you put it in the bulletin that nominations is meeting. So you give everybody a heads up not to answer their phone. Nominations may go something like this. So we go, okay, well, we've got, some empty spots to fill. So what's the first thing we do? Pull out the pictorial. Let's see who isn't serving currently. Now, are you going to call them or should I? Well, now look, if you call them, they're more likely to say yes than to me. Come on, tell me. You all don't strategize that way? And then the phone call goes something like this. So, hi, this is Kay. Yeah, how you doing? I'm just wondering, you are such a faithful person and we really see some gifts in you. And I'm just calling to see if you would be interested in serving on, let's say the worship committee. Person asks on the other end of the line, so what does that mean? Oh, don't worry about it. I just need your name to fill in on the form. They haven't met in months. So just say yes, I'll put your name down, and don't worry about it. You don't have any responsibility. So we have all of these people who are filling up places, and in their mind, they're serving because their name's on a piece of paper. Oh, I couldn't do this because I'm on the worship committee. And so we have all these spots to fill that are dysfunctional. But what if instead, friends, we only had those required committees by book of discipline, that's what we're going to talk about today, which can be only two, and everything else is a team. Teams come together when there's work to do. and they disband when the work is completed. So that means instead of having a standing committee of children's ministry, we pull a Vacation Bible School team together to pull off Vacation Bible School. And let me tell you, the younger folks are going to say, I will commit to 2 or 3 months to pull off Vacation Bible School, but I am not going to commit to 3 years, although it's a lifetime. We know that. We just tell them it's 3 years, on a committee. So in some ways, we have undervalued the jobs of our church because we recruit people and put them on a list and then never use them. I've been in churches that have done spiritual gifts inventory, and we go through all of these Sundays and paperwork and evaluation, and boy, we have a really pretty Excel spreadsheet. But do we ever go back and match people up? Or do we say, we need people in the nursery to rock those babies? And someone says, I'd love to do that. And then we never call them. Well, I put myself up and nobody called, so evidently I'm not suited. So how we use people is so important. And we have to think generational differences when we're thinking about how we're going about the life of the church. The problem, see, with most of our structures in our church is they actually promote disunity and enable dysfunction. I gave you a perfect example that I lived through. It was so complicated, it was dysfunctional. Now, we were a so-called healthy church that was reaching new people. But you see, the very structure that was supporting it was not healthy. So it makes me wonder, had we had a healthy structure, what we could have been doing. Most structures have very clear lines of authority, but no lines of accountability. Yes, we could, and more importantly, we should hold people accountable in the church. Well, they're volunteers. Well, this is Christ's business. This is what Christ wants us to do. Why would we not hold people accountable to helping them grow in their discipleship to be faithful? Why wouldn't we help people find different ways to serve in their spiritual giftedness rather than leaving them somewhere where they're ineffective? We're hurting the church and we're hurting that person. But you see, once again, this is where our relationships with one another trump the mission and vision of the church. In most structures, all responsibility is on the pastor, but that pastor has little or no authority. You see, sometimes it's this, what we call spoke and hub kind of thing. It's like the pastor is here, and all of these spokes go out around the pastor, right? And so nothing gets done without going through or connecting with the life of the pastor. The average worship attendance in the Susquehanna Conference is 66. Of our churches, our average worship attendance, if you take all the attendance and all of our congregations, our average worship attendance per church is 66. Now, have y'all ever heard the Velcro ball philosophy? Probably not, because I made it up. Statistically, it tells you that any one person can't have any more than about 80 relationships, personal connections, right? I mean, think about your life, all right? So once you build up 80 relationships, what happens? There is no more room on your Velcro ball. And so we have the very sized churches that one pastor can manage, because all relationships go directly to the pastor. So if we want to be a multiplying congregation, if we want to be a congregation that is missionally focused to reach new people, then all of us have to be Velcro balls. You see, mature disciples are Velcro balls. All of us are connecting with the people in our congregation. We're connecting to one another, and we need a leader in our pastor, but we cannot be pastor-centered, or we are keeping ourselves to the point of only being a congregation that can be sustainable up to 80 people. Sometimes our structures make it impossible to make difficult and timely decisions. If someone was going to ask to do something in your congregation, how many steps would it take? Think about that. Especially if it had something to do with the building and maybe even personnel and money and overall programming. That's at least 4 steps. And I can guarantee you the law of averages means that if I needed to go to trustees and then my next stop was council just met 2 days before. And so I'm going to have to wait another month or 2 to go back to them. So what happens? 4, 5, 6 months to go through the approval process. Now, friends, I don't know about you, but out in the world, that would never fly. And remember, if we go back to our young people who have been conditioned to this quick-paced world, and they deal with that kind of decision-making process, they are going to be frustrated and probably not engaged. Think about it this way. How many leaders do you have in your church that are leaders in the community but not leaders in your church? If that's the case, most likely they've become frustrated with how decisions get made or not made. And they're going, I don't want to engage in that. Because they're used to how decisions are made out in the secular world. So think about that. I want you to write a number down. How many steps do you think it takes for somebody to get a decision made in your church? It's really hard to win the game if you're inwardly focused. Think about that. If it's only about your team and you're not preparing on your opponent, how are you going to show up? In other words, well, it's all about getting our things together as opposed to it's all about showing up for the game and being prepared for what we're doing. You see, when we become outwardly focused, it's more about our community and those that don't have a relationship with Christ than what's going on the inside. Simplified, accountable structure allows us to make that shift. So there is another way, and it's this simplified, accountable structure. Now, some of you, I know, probably have the Book of Discipline in your bag, or maybe it's still under your pillow. See, your district superintendent has his with him. So if any of you want to look it up, you're welcome to look at paragraph 247.2, and if it doesn't matter to you, I guarantee you it will matter to someone in your church, so just be prepared to be able to cite it, okay? Paragraph 247.2 allows you to organize the life of the congregation so that you can be more missionally centered, as long as you meet the Book of Discipline minimum requirements, all right? So this is our permission giving. Now, interestingly enough, this was put in the Book of Discipline originally for small churches. But do you know who were the first to adopt it? Large churches, because they saw the effectiveness and the efficiency in it. All right, now I'm going old school here. Did any of you used to have like name placards on your desk? Okay, y'all with me? All right, so these aren't names, but they're titles, right? So currently, we would have 4 different committees, all right? And our first one is council.
I didn't know.
Play along, Jack. Is our council or our board, right? So think about that. How many people, just jot that number down, how many people currently serve on your council or your board? All right. Next, we have trustees. Trustees, all right? So how many are currently serving as trustees in your congregation? Okay. All right. The next administrative team we have is? Staff parish relations, okay? How many people do you have serving on that committee? All right. Next one. Finance. How many folks do we have serving on finance? Add that number up. Now, this number would include some of the people from over here, but it would also include people at large, right? Members at large. Or sometimes it's everybody in the church. Okay? What's your number? Shout them out. What's your total number? 76. That's a large church. 17. And we're disagreeing on that number. Another number over here? 12? 10? 30? Most of the time, you have 30 to 40 people on average tied up in those 4 teams. At least. Minimum. All right? Now, when you meet as a trustee, what are we talking about? The facility. What else? Grounds. What else? Parsonage. What else? Legal stuff. Any kind of equipment. Maybe endowments. I know some of you are looking at each other go, endowments? Endowments? All right. When we're with staff parish or pastor parish relations committee, what are we talking about? Personnel. Pastor. Salaries. Benefits. Problems. Filling out the forms, right? All right. And then we have finance. What are we talking about in finance? Budget. Lack of money. Fundraising. Stewardship. All right. So if each of you just met once a month, then we can see to get from one to the other, if we have multiple stops, it's going to take multiple months to get through to make a decision. Yes? All right. So what if the 4 of you put your name placards down and you sit down? You too. Thank you. But instead, we had a name placard that looks like this. Each person on the team does all the functions. Now, we just talked about a lot of different responsibilities, did we not? But how many of the things have to be repeated in multiple places, those conversations, right? So rather than sitting here with my sole responsibility and the lens that I'm looking at through trustees, instead, I'm going to sit over here and go, I am looking at this holistically for the life of the congregation through finance and trustees and SBR and the overarching council or board. You follow me? So you no longer have 4 separate teams. Instead, we have one team that functions in all 4 places, that meets together once a month. Are we there? Okay. Now, you can sit down. Thank you. Didn't you do a great job, Vanna? Now, one thing that I want you to think through is what we have done in the past is our leadership, those 4 teams, have functioned in a management style rather than a governing style. Okay? How many of you are familiar with like a church or a school board model? And they hire principals, superintendent who hires the principals, right? All right. Does the school board hire individual teachers? No. Does the school board decide what curriculum is going to be done on a day-to-day basis in the classrooms? They approve curriculum overall, but they do not do the lesson planning, right? Now, do they approve individual teacher salaries? Probably not, but a general budget for what each building has to spend on personnel, right? Do you think that they are telling the janitor which cleaning products to use? Do you see where I'm going? You see, our typical church is managing the day-to-day operations of the church. And because of that, it's no one is looking at the big picture of the church. You see, because we're so tied up in the urgency of what's going on, it doesn't allow us to, what I say, climb up onto the balcony and say, are we steering this ship in the right direction? Another metaphor is we have too many people swabbing the decks of the ship and nobody's steering the ship. So in other words, we're just being tossed around by the waves. And we are frustrated that those waves are slopping up on the side, that we're having to swab the decks even more. But you see, if somebody was steering the ship, we would have had the opportunity to maybe steer around that storm or the bumpy weather. That's the biggest shift, folks, is the purpose, the intent, the focus of what this new group could do. So it's not just about putting fewer people around the table, because we can all imagine that happen, amen? But the conversation needs to change when we do it as well, because then it's not only a technical change, but it's the adaptive change to get us back on track of the structure no longer driving our church, but our vision driving our church, the unique way that we make disciples. So let's look specifically at what this structure can look like. All right, now the first thing I need to unpack is this. Do you see that it says 6 to 9 members at the top? Okay? Do you see anywhere where it says trustees, finance, or SPR representatives? No. Okay? Now, I'll tell you, I've been teaching this for probably about 10 years now. And we used to put right up there saying 2 or 3 SPR reps, 2 or 3 trustee reps, 2 or 3 finance reps. Okay? Because what we had trouble with is wrapping our mind around the function that we used to do. And so who's going to do it? Don't we need to have some responsibility and some point people, right? But here's what's happened in reality. Those 2 or 3 people thought they were the trustee committee. Those 2 or 3 people thought they were the SPR committee. Those 2 or 3 people thought they were the finance committee. They're not. And so we had 2 people happened. We had 2 people fill out the paperwork for the pastor's evaluation and chose to say stay when the rest of the committee were going to say move. You see, because it takes 9 people, book of discipline minimum, to be on staff parish relations. So that's the reason we're moving away from those titles, is because of the function. They tend to function as in the old model, even though we were in the new model. So when you have people on your board, let's call them board members, not trustees, not SPR, not finance. You follow me? If we do, we're going to get ourselves into some trouble or dysfunctionality, right? Everyone that you recruit is all 4. Everyone takes all 4 responsibilities, okay? Now, what we also need to have, though, is one of those people need to be a board chair. So you need a 9-people minimum. And if you've called it council or board before, I don't care what you change it to, change the name. Because if we just continue to call them what we've always called them, it doesn't help us make the transition into we're doing something new. Okay? So first of all, change the name. You'll need a chair. Now, if you're going to run minimum 9, you can add a 10th person as the chair, or one of those 9 could be the chair. You need a lay delegate to annual conference. One of those 9 could be one of those, or you can add a person. Same with a lay leader, okay? If you have a chartered United Methodist Women or a chartered United Methodist Men, they have the opportunity to have representation, okay? But they're put on by nominations as part of the leadership of the board. They are not there to represent United Methodist Women. Does that make sense? So we need to make very sure that they have the right to have someone, but it's not a requirement. If it's not chartered, again, it's not a United Methodist Women, and so that does not apply. Same with United Methodist Women or Men. The other is a youth person. Now, you have to be careful because of the trustee requirements of minimum age to make legal decisions, so sometimes they have to set some things out. But this is not your youth director. Okay, if we are trying to reach people that are young, let's have the truly young people at the table and allow them to have a voice, right? Now, are you ready for this? This is where it really kind of blows people's mind. Best practice. Have your chair be your lay leader, your lay delegate, and the liaison to the district superintendent for purposes of SPR. Follow me? Okay. Best practice is that your chair is also your lay leader, lay delegate, chair of trustees, and SPR liaison to the district superintendent. Now, I know that sounded like a lot, but they're functioning in all those places anyway, friends. The problem is, if you have someone on the team functioning in one of those places, then information and communication comes in from the side rather than the top. So, perfect example. We had an SPR liaison, SPR chair in old language, to the district superintendent who was serving on the new board, but was not the chair. There was conversation going on with the district superintendent that the chair had no idea what was going on. So that way, that information flows in from the top. You see, things are going to be streamlined, so it sounds like a whole lot, but we're just focusing everyone in one common direction. So imagine that your board chair is the one that is hearing from the people in the congregation as lay leader. Or to be thinking that they're the lay delegate, that they're going to go to annual conference and come back as a board chair and a lay leader to be sharing with the congregation what's going on. There's alignment there. There's alignment. So simplified structure allows us to set boundaries. Okay? The boundaries that each church needs to set is what I call guiding principles. Okay? Now, please don't feel that you need to rewrite the book of discipline. It's still there. It will still guide you. All right? So don't worry about what's already in the book of discipline. It does not need to be rewritten. But there are some specific things about the life of your congregation that would be helpful. So, for instance, instead of the decisions about spending at the trustees meeting, now called the Simplified Structure, instead you give parameters that allow things to happen without you having to make a decision on everything. So, in other words, if you have something in the budget that is approved, and it's under your max dollars for bids, then you have already given permission to spend that money because you approve the budget. We don't need to come back and talk about it again. If, perhaps, that you have anybody who is on the building maintenance team, we'll come back to that in a minute, has the authority to spend up to $1,000 or whatever your limit is without getting bids. But anything over 1,000 or 3 or 5, whatever makes sense in your context, they need 3 bids, right? This is a guiding principle. You're going to get 3 bids, and you give preferential treatment to local vendors. And so if it's within 5 or 10% of the next bid, the lowest bid, then you give them permission to go on and have the work done. Trustees wouldn't have to meet. The guiding principles give permission for things to happen within healthy boundaries. Does that help with your meeting over here? Okay? So just the same thing. Think about hiring policies that give healthy parameters that we don't have to come back and talk about it. But they give permission. So every time a decision comes to your board, I want you to think, if we had a guiding principle around this, could we have kept them from having to delay this decision to come and talk to us? Right? So guiding principles is a living, breathing document that is permission giving for ministries to occur without you micromanaging and giving governing policy for them to happen. So all you're dealing with are the exceptions. Make sense? Guiding principles are so important. Do not skip over them. And if you did not put guiding principles together when you went to it, you're already in it, please take the time to go back and put those guiding principles in. Woohoo! All right, so not 2 challenges, but 4 challenges of structure. First, management of communication. We've already talked about that just a little bit. You've got to over-communicate, and especially in the beginning, as people are living into this themselves and trying to understand. And the best way of communication is not only your town hall meetings that we talked about, but also emails and newsletters, and from a variety of people, not just the pastor, right? Let him hear from a variety of people who are living into this model. You have to make sure that you are doing decision-making that is aligned to effectiveness. You see, when structure is driving our church, most of the time we put more policies and checklists in place. What I want you to be thinking about is how are we putting guiding principles together to allow things to happen rather than tighten the screws up tighter and tighter and tighter. You know, I've been in churches that are 30 in worship attendance and they have a 100-page building usage policy. Tell us what's driving that church. We have to make the shift to accountability. If we're not willing to hold one another accountable to aligning our church with its purpose of making disciples, this is too risky of a model for you to practice. We need to shift to strategic and generative thinking. Let's not be a reporting agency any longer, but let's really live into what should we be talking about, how should we be focusing on alignment, and most importantly, our community to reach new people. If you look at just 3 major categories of how the board would be spending their time together, you would be looking at 3 different sections. The first part of your time together would be spiritual formation, leadership development. And who are we reaching? A third of your time, yes. You are the leaders of the church. How are we pouring into the leaders of our church for spiritual formation? How are we pouring into the very leaders of our church for leadership development? How are we modeling as leaders of the church what we're asking the others in the pews to do? We would spend 1/3 of our time actually on accountability. How are we doing on reaching the very goals that were set? Do we need to shift some resources around to allow that to happen? And then the last is dealing with the pressing decisions and issues. And friends, this is where we have spent all of our time in the past. And it's intentionally at the end of the agenda. Because if it were at the beginning, you say we're going to meet for 90 minutes, I can guarantee you that first third will fill up all 90 minutes and we won't have time for the rest. So how are we pouring into people first? And then let's deal with the big picture stuff. And then let's deal with the problem solving and the exceptions to our guiding principles. So here is a recommended agenda for your new leadership team. Does this look perhaps a little different than the one you're using now? All right, how many lay people are in the room? All right, I give you permission to pray. Not that you needed it. But our pastor is not the only one that can pray. I would love to see that the first time your pastor speaks up is the review of goals. Folks, United Methodist is a lay movement, and we need to reclaim our responsibility. So let's have our lay people beginning in prayer. Let's have our lay people do our spiritual formation. Let's have our lay people do leadership development. You see, we can't become pastor dependent. So how are we bringing our own leadership and leadership expectations into it? And then review of new people. This is when we're going to look at our vital statistics. And I know some of you love to push back on it's not all about the numbers. You are right. You are right. Ministry is about narratives. But y'all, when the narratives are bearing fruit, it shows up in the numbers. We need to be looking at those trends as leaders of the church. I mean, when you go to the doctor, what's the first thing they do? Take your vitals, which means what? The dreaded scales, right? Temperature, blood pressure, pulse, right? That doesn't tell you what you have, but if any of those things are out of whack, it leads them into a direction, right? That's the same thing with vital signs of a church. It doesn't tell the whole story, but at least it tells us where our gaps are, where our issues are, right? It's important for you to have those in your packet every month. Then we look at our goals, all right? Which means you had to have put the goals together the fall before. So friends, this is typically the time of year that you would have been finishing up your strategic ministry planning retreat. Which means that we have pulled people together who are our existing leaders and the new leaders. And we're going to go away overnight, from a Friday night to a Saturday night. And we're going to review what we've done in the past year. We're going to talk about the life cycle of the church. And where are we? Are we on the upside? Are we on the downside? What do we need to do? Is vision still driving our church? If not, do we need to change it? What are our annual trends? And how did we do on our goals that we're looking to reach this year? And then we look ahead and say, where are we headed? What are we going to focus those 3 to 5 things, big picture things next year? Because see, if we don't do that, what happens? We plan by copying one year's calendar over to the next. So those goals are set in the fall for the upcoming year, and this is where your conversation with your pastor starts. So the pastor, you ask the question, so how are we doing on that first goal? Tell us the progress that was made. You see, we're not talking about individual ministries because, see, that's what gets us down into the trenches too far into management. But rather, we're talking big picture. The overall church goals as opposed to individual ministries and reports. Then we get to the problem issues or problem solving. These are things that are outside the guiding principles that we need some extra help on. And reminder, this is where we can ask ourselves, do we need to provide or create a new guiding principle that would have allowed this to happen without it having to come here? And what would that look like? And add it to your guiding principles. The next, we get to the approval and questions from the packet. So the week before, an administrative person, whatever that looks like in your church, would be responsible for gathering all the information that goes out to the board members. That would be the minutes of the previous session. It would be the financial report. It would be vital signs. It would be number of new people, or number of first-time guests, number of returning guests, and anything that relates to the pressing issues that we're going to have to face. One of the things that we also want to be thinking about is a leadership covenant. Because one of the things that we covenant as leaders together to say, I'm going to attend those meetings. I'm going to read my packet ahead of time and come prepared. I don't know about you, but I've gone to meetings and you walk in the door and there's the table. And you pick up a copy of the minutes, you pick up a copy of the financial, you pick up a copy of this report and that report. Now, how much time have I spent reviewing that and can speak to it intelligently at all? Or we say we need to approve the minutes and everybody's heads are down, we're reading the minutes for the first time then. Well, now how accurate is that? So part of what we're doing is we're helping prepare ahead of time. And we do better work that way. And we don't need people to read us reports any longer because they've been given to us ahead of time and we have those. Okay? One of the other things in your leadership covenant would be that you are moving towards being a mature disciple of Jesus Christ, which means you're living your vows. Which would be, you want somebody in leadership who is at worship. You want somebody on leadership who is in a small group, who is committed to prayer, is tithing or moving to a tithe, who is working in ministry and doing service projects. You see, we put these people in leadership roles and then we don't put expectations around it. And then what are we modeling? I did a consultation in one church and we had a finance chair that I interviewed and I said, so tell me about your church attendance. And he said, church attendance? I haven't attended here in 5 years. His name was on the checkbook, friends. Now, that's an extreme example. But these things should not be going on. But see, we have to have a covenant to begin with. So at that fall leadership retreat, we're putting that covenant together to say, this is how we're going to lead together. And we're going to hold one another accountable for what this leadership looks like. We're going to turn our cell phones off. We're going to be fully present in those 90 minutes. So when we get to the packet, you see, it's almost like a consent thing. We don't have to go through all of it. Right? The next to the last piece is communication. Communication. And what I mean by that is, have you ever walked out of a meeting and you go, well, I heard this, and somebody else said, well, no, that's not what happened. I heard this. So communication is that pause at the end of our time together and say, all right, what was decided here today? Let's restate it for the purpose of the minutes and for everyone to hear distinctly. All right? Now, who needs to know about this decision? How do we need to communicate it? So who needs to know, and how are we going to communicate it, and who's responsible to communicate it? So this is a way for us just to kind of all get on the same page, make sure we all understand what happened and what the next steps forward are. All right? And then, laity, we pray ourselves out. Okay? That's what your agenda would look like with accountable leadership. Make sure that every year that you're going away and planning annually to evaluate, to review, set new goals, and set the budget after strategies are designed. You see, if you set the budget and then you say, here's the goals, ministry teams, now develop your ministries or strategies around that, but they had no say in the budget, we're doing it backwards. Which means the goals have to be set early enough in the year so that your ministry teams can put the strategies together to actually request the budget they need to make it happen. And then if the budget isn't there to make it happen, then leaders, maybe we have to adjust the goals. But do you see, the goals drive as opposed to the budget driving that way? Okay? Which means you have to start it a little earlier in order to make that happen.